Welcome to the DataStack Show. Today we're going to talk with Verl and Kostas. They are doing some really interesting things for some really large companies, some of the largest companies in the world, actually, which is fascinating. And just to give a little preview here, Verl is part of Claravine, and what they do is basically take sort of unstructured context around internal data at a company as it exists in the form of things like marketing assets, and essentially applies a schema to them so that there's standardization across this massive, multinational organization, which is really interesting. I want to ask him we talked about the concept of a schema as you and I were prepping for the show. I want to know if you think about a schema across a large multinational organization for creative content, what does that even look like? I mean, what are those data points, and what kind of data are they populating that schema with? How about you?
Yeah, I want to ask him how you can build one schema to rule them all. It sounds very powerful.
It does.
So yeah, I really want to see how you can build something like this. What are the approaches, the stakeholders involved, and how different it looks from organization to organization. At the end, how much we can standardize things. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. I think it's one of these problems that you don't hear about too often, but in the future we will have to deal with it in very smaller organizations. So it's interesting to have this conversation with him and see how tomorrow will look like.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's dig in with Verl. Verl, welcome to the DataStack Show.
Great to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so much to talk about with data standardization, especially in the context of marketing data, which is going to be a treat for me. But before we get there, just give us a brief background on yourself and how you ended up doing what you're doing today at Claravine.
Yeah, so prior to Claravine, I joined Claravine in 2018. Prior to Claravine, I spent about 12 years, first at a company called Omniture, which was kind of a leader in the web analytics space. The company was acquired by Adobe, and I think it was 2010, and then spent about another 8 years at Adobe. And in my role there, I was leading up strategy around what now is the Experience Cloud, and also corporate M&A. So corp dev, M&A. If you think about what the Experience Cloud at Adobe really is a compilation of about 11 or 12 acquisitions done over a 10, 12-year period that ultimately has kind of resulted in what is now the Experience Cloud they have there. And so I spent a long period of time helping kind of build that business, if you want to think about it that way. In 2018, ran into a friend who had started a small company, which is now Claravine. And as he and I were talking, he was kind of at a point where he's like, I'm not sure what I want to do with this. We've got some great customers. We're kind of stalled out as far as growth. We have product issues, and we need to raise capital. And so as he and I were talking, I kind of said, listen, I can introduce you to some people. I'm happy. I love what I'm doing. I've kind of got a 4-year plan to retire. And as we kept talking, I saw what he was doing in relation to where I was seeing challenges from my time at Adobe, where we had spent all this time acquiring all these technologies and solutions, and had done a lot of work around integration at the workflow layer and in other ways, and integrating those solutions. What hadn't happened though is there was no kind of standardized data model underneath it. Adobe's really kind of it's now with their kind of the Adobe Data Platform and other things, and there's mergers of CDPs, but there wasn't at that point any kind of focus around the data side of the integrations and the data side of kind of standardizing that. And so as I started thinking about I started looking at what they were doing here at Claravine. Again, it was 4 or 5 people at that time. It really struck me that there's a need in the marketplace, especially as we think about this, what I think of as the 2010s were the kind of the decade of SaaS applications and explosion of that marketplace, to where now you have 50 to 100 point solutions in any enterprise in the marketing organization. The problem that they're running into is they were never really architected to work well together, and even at the data layer.
Yeah.
And so as you've seen the emergence of kind of the enterprise, kind of it's going to be a cloud-based kind of data infrastructure that's exploded in the last couple of years, and it's becoming more readily available even in the functional areas, it became clear to us, that to me at least, that there's going to be a need to standardize and kind of create common language or taxonomy, or if we call it dictionary, whatever we call it, across these applications, especially as that, and it has to have context, especially as you collapse that data into these single instances in the cloud. And so as I was there thinking about the problems they're solving and the problems I was seeing even in our own business inside of the applications that we had acquired, it became clear to me that if we're struggling with this at Adobe for our customers, the brands themselves have got to have a bigger problem, because the number of applications they're trying to deal with is multiple times, what we were dealing with just from a solution perspective to take the Experience Cloud to market.
Fascinating. Okay, I want to take a quick detour here. So what a fascinating experience, sort of being involved in building out a product suite from the M&A side. I mean, that's just fascinating, right? It's that's so interesting to me on so many levels. But I was going to ask you, and you mentioned it a little bit, looking at when we think of, especially about like marketing tooling or customer engagement tooling and the suite of infrastructure that surrounds that, from analytics to actually the tools that are sending messages.
Yeah.
How did you have an evaluation criteria on the data side? I know you said there was struggle around that, but as you're thinking about building a product suite, I think that when you think about customer experience, evaluating the ability to layer those products in from a data standpoint was part of the rubric, even from an M&A standpoint. How did you think about that?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. And I think this has evolved dramatically. I think thinking about this is, I think, much more mature. I think it's much more mature today than it was like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And largely,
Sure.
I think it's been driven by some of the changes in the data ecosystem and just kind of the ways that companies are looking at their business, not so much where it was, I think back then there was more about the siloed approach. And you think about applications, about how do we get efficiency and scale in a channel? And I think what the world's turned to more holistically, and I saw a data point the other day saying, before the pandemic, about 30% of the interactions with brands was digital. Now it's like 55, 60%. So there's a huge push forward.
Yeah.
What's happened is that when I was at Adobe, we were thinking about it as this application and this application, there's data here that we need to get here. And for specific
Sure.
uses. So it's more about how do we push specific pieces of data between the applications. It wasn't kind of stepping back and looking at it saying, holistically, what should that operating data model look like for the marketing organization holistically? Because I think the industry, even back in the 2016, 2017 timeframe, was just starting to everyone was talking about a single view of the customer and a unified profile and all this stuff. But the reality is that you had on one side ad tech solutions, you had MarTech solutions, you had CX solutions, and they were sort of in different groups. I think what you're seeing now is the convergence of this stuff around the experience and around the customer more so, and it's driving this really different way of thinking about the data necessary to operate the business, not the data to run the application and do my job in a channel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, super interesting. I've referred to that before as kind of the daisy chain paradigm, where it's like, okay, well, I have data here, and then I need to get it here, and then I have it here, but then I also need to get it here. And so you end up with kind of this daisy chain architecture that degrades over time, almost like a game of telephone, because every system has its own flavor of database and data definitions and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I saw it even in a sense of like, even within the cloud that Adobe had built, forget about integrating other applications in that are not owned by under the Adobe brand. That was even complex. That was, again, it was a daisy chain even within those applications. And then when you think about it you put the lens from the brand's perspective, it's much more complicated than it looks like from Adobe's perspective or from Salesforce's perspective, or the kind of the big, the large enterprise software companies out there.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so thank you for humoring me with that little detour, because it's fascinating. Let's talk about could you use a specific example of the type of brand and the user who's like, I am facing this problem every day in my job and it's really painful, and Claravine comes in and like, this is so much better. Like, describe that for us. I'd love for you to get specific if you can, of like,
Yeah.
I was doing things this way, there are data problems because of X, Y, and Z, and this is the new way that we're doing it.
Yeah, and it might be helpful for me to even kind of back up a little bit and explain. When I came to Claravine, it really was, we were helping analytics teams within the marketing organization address data problems. So if you think about it, the analytics teams are publishing or creating reports and doing analysis. What we see with a lot of our customers is they do the analysis and then they come up with this, you got the report, and at the bottom there's this other bucket that 25, 35, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the data drops into. And it's varying degrees depending on how complicated or how integrated they're trying to report on. But what we really kind of were initially helping solve was taking data out of the other and actually specifying it and actually putting context around it so you could actually attribute it in some way.
And so just to put a sharper point on that, so like, and I'm just thinking through like our data engineers and analysts who are listening, in my own experience, it's like, okay, and reports that I've seen or that I've like helped build data for or whatever, it's like, okay, we have, paid search campaigns as a bucket. We have like sort of like where are, I guess, is that what you're getting at? Is
that's one type of report. It's just like, by channel or whatever. I mean, we've all sat in those meetings. I have a finance background, but I spent in 99, I switched over to digital marketing because I thought this is more of an analytical problem than it's a creative problem. It's actually an interesting problem to solve. And so I've sat in these meetings before with teams where everybody comes to the meeting, you're reading out channel by channel by channel, and you start rolling it up and the numbers do not roll up, they do not roll down. And so, you aggregate the individual numbers from the channel people sitting in the rooms and seats, and it's X. You look at the aggregated reports and you're like, no, it's like 0.4X or 0.6X or 0.7X, like who's being successful or not. And it's still a problem today because a lot of that reporting is, even though it's done in a centralized, through centralized applications, the foundation is broken. The premise that we have is the foundation of that data. If there's not, again, we think about it as data standards, but so that's one of the things we're helping solve, is really kind of taking and creating more specificity and more detail and more context to that data that improves that reporting. That's one thing. But that's just on the reporting side. But if you take that out even further and say, hey, well, the same data that in a lot of cases you're using for reporting, you're using data to do other things like optimize spend across channels. And I've had situations, I was talking to one of the largest consumer electronic companies out there that, the brand is associated with a fruit. And we sat with one of their larger teams, and they're like, listen, we got a problem. 1 out of every 7 days, we cannot optimize ad spend because we're having to rebuild all the models, we're having to clean all the data up. And so there's literally 1 day out of every 7 where we're still spending. We spend, $50, $100 million a day. We're flying blind, and then everything's delayed. And so with that organization, what we really helped them do was to reduce the time to insight dramatically by reducing the amount of data that had to be cleaned up in the operations side of things. So think about where marketing ops, data ops, and ad ops, they spend a lot of time between execution and kind of optimization, cleaning data. And that's what we're trying to help them eliminate by adding context and creating standards in the way that data is captured.
Okay, so when we say standards and context, I want to dig into those terms, but could you just give us a sense of the types of data that are the inputs there, right? And so, I mean, like ad spend, I mentioned, that's like an obvious one for marketing, but like clickstream data, could you just give us like, what is the breadth of data? Because certainly that's a huge contributor to the problem, is that you have a huge variety of different types of data coming from a bunch of different places.
Absolutely. And to be clear, we are not a data collection, like an analytics or data collection application. The way I describe it is, and there's a company that I think in the 80s or 90s called, it was BASF, and they're like, we don't make the products you use every day, we make them better. And so our opportunity is to improve the ROI and the value that our customers are getting from other applications or analytics, whether it's analytics, whether it's CDPs, whether it's ad serving or whatever else they're doing, where we're spending dollars. And so what we really are, when we think about that types of data, it is clickstream data, but it's not saying we're collecting the clickstream data and replacing it. It's appending onto that clickstream data context about a campaign or an experience. It's appending to content, standardized data about the content itself in relation to all the other content in the organization and across different DAMs, across different CMSs. And so it's really trying to take this complexity that exists in the marketing organizations. Today it's marketing. I think there's other applications outside of marketing that we're talking to companies about, but it's really trying to take some of that complexity and create a layer underneath of it or alongside it that has standards around it, that is attached to or can be attached to that data to enrich it, extend it, and also create meaning between some of the data that right now doesn't have necessarily the, really great ways to associate it.
This may not be the right way to think about it, so tell me if I'm off here, but it almost sounds, I mean, this sounds amazing. It almost sounds like you're taking a schema designed for full visibility and stamping it on, the data across every, sort of data repository.
I actually think that's a great way to describe it. I think that's a simple way to describe it, because it is almost like an imprint against that. It's not that we're collecting the behavior or the streaming data. It's a set of data that gets appended to that or stamped to that as well.
Yep. Yeah, because like if you think about like stamping a schema on a certain set of data, like there's a delta if it doesn't, contain all pieces of the schema. Maybe I'm extending that metaphor a little too far. Kostas, let me know. But okay, I have two more questions. I know Kostas has some as well. The first one is, could you give some examples of the context that you add onto a specific type of data or a couple types of data? Just, like you mentioned, advertising performance or even content, which is interesting. Like in the context of digital asset management or other things like that is pretty fascinating. Like, what does that look like? You have a piece of content. What are you adding to it? You have advertising data. What are you adding to it?
Yeah. So like if you think about content, there's a lot of situations where you have people creating content, which is more of kind of the content creation. I'll call it the creative side of things. You've got the content side of things where all of a sudden it gets loaded up into a CMS. What you have happening is you have typically people creating it that have a creative brief and all this context around this piece of content was created for this purpose, for this business unit, for this stage of funnel, for this geography, for this demographic, for it's all that information and insight that sits in the creator's head. The problem is that once that stuff goes in the DAM, there's not a great way to. You've got creators all over the world. Like you think of a large multinational organization, you have creators in agencies, you have creators internally, you have people all over the globe, they're speaking different languages. It's like, how do you create a standardized language across all those teams, peoples, and geographies and business units? And that's really what we kind of help them provide. And so instead of having, once it gets loaded into the CMS, instead of having that content, hold on one second. Instead of trying to have the content, the people that are loading the content into the CMS, add that context, that that piece of creative, that ID with that creative is actually associated with a bunch of context in our application that allows them to really kind of create a different way of solving this problem.
That's really interesting because anyone who has worked with data knows that, like, I mean, I don't want to be too incriminating here, but relying on human input, for critical data is never a good idea, because people are always going to get it wrong, fat finger it. Like it's the least reliable way to capture data in many ways.
Yes, and it's interesting though, so if you think about it though, those individuals have all the context, a lot of the context around what is actually happening. And so in some ways, it's funny, I was talking to one of our customers about this, and they said, this one said, you create the illusion of choice, that we create the illusion of choice inside of our application for the end user in that situation where there's an end user in the application, that really kind of forces them down a path that limits the errors that can kind of get created. So you're almost kind of forcing a set of decisions on a much smaller, and depending on who they are, what channel they manage, there's all sorts of controls that you can build and logic you can build around what level of choice
interesting
you create. And as data is, through integrations, there's a lot of context you can get from the integrations of where other data is coming from that help kind of inform what options we should or shouldn't give them.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of taking a consumer app optimization mindset where you define very clear pathways and success for the user and applying that to like internal creators inside of a business, which is super interesting. But could you give one example maybe on the paid side, just so we have another example of the context that you layer onto a particular type of data, like advertising data? Is that performance data or?
Yeah, so we work really closely with a lot of our customers, both internally and with their agencies, around that performance data. And so what we're helping them add into that is, in some cases, there may be data fields that are collected in one application that are not available in other applications, or the way they name fields in one application are not consistent with other applications. So it's trying to help solve naming kind of differences in the way that fields are named, and we can do some of that mapping for them. The other way to think about it is, again, similar to a creative brief, think about a campaign brief. There's all sorts of context and insight in that campaign briefs, which are typically managed inside of spreadsheets, that we help to onboard into kind of the enterprise data, the data model, if you want to call it that.
Sure.
And so it's things around what stage of funnel is the campaign on, what was the segment, what was the creative, and it's mapping that creative then back to standard, mapping. It's creating almost like a way to map even across elements of an experience that just are not specifically, and standardize data across those elements of an experience that are not necessarily just specific to the campaign itself.
Super interesting. Okay, I have one more question, and then I'm going to hand the mic to Kostas because I've been monopolizing this conversation. So how do you do that? Is my next question, because that sounds very complex, especially when you're thinking about, organizations. And I mean, it sounds like, sort of Fortune 500 level, even 100 level companies that are just massive, complex organizations that, are producing content across who knows how many vectors and business units and product lines and all that sort of stuff. So how do you do it?
Yeah, it's interesting. So where we thrive, where I think the opportunity exists for this is in those organizations where there's more complexity, and you're hitting at it. So we have a customer, right? I think one of our customers, they have about 700 users across the globe, both internal and agency users, specifically around standardizing taxonomy around content. And in that situation, we are baked into the workflow. When you're going through that creative process and submitting creative briefs and things, we are integrated into the workflow and capture data, in that example, out of Workfront. And so it's through integrations that we get access to data, and it's through integrations as users are adding data into fields, either in other applications, we derive that information into our application, into our solution. What we have at that point is the ability to compare what was input to what the available standards are, and identify where there are differences between what is maybe input manually in another application and what the organization identifies as the standard around that field or that attribute in the data. And we're able to identify where there's breakage in that, either through our solution, automate the correction of that, or allow the individuals and organizations to surface those areas where there are problems, fix them in our application, and then identify ways to enforce it upstream.
This is very interesting. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to be a little bit too technical, but I cannot stop thinking all this time on how do you design a data model like this? Where do you start? In my mind, when we are doing data modeling, because it's like modeling in general, right? What we are trying to do is create, let's say, an abstraction of real worlds. So there are two ways that I can think that you can do that. Go high level and be okay, what I want to do is I want to model the marketing domain. What are the main concepts that we have there? What are the main processes that we have, and try to create a data model around that. And then all the data, all the instances that they come from different applications, go there and try to connect them on this, align them with this data model. The other way is go from the application level, right? Which is the other extreme. I have these applications, they have 10 different data models. Let's align these 10 different data models and see what happens at the end. But my feeling, at least, is that none of them is at the end so successful. You need something else, something in between, probably. So how did you do that?
Yeah, so by the way, I agree with what you're saying, those options. And the way we think about it is, it's not necessarily an either, it's an either or, it should be much more of an and. So it's interesting where we come into organizations, and it's becoming more and more this way. I think as companies are becoming more mature about this, and we've seen it specifically in the last kind of 18 months, is we are now sitting in situations where it's not just the marketing organization sitting in the room talking about the data model and the data taxonomy. What's happening now is they're bringing in the enterprise, and I didn't know these people existed, but they're all over out there. There's enterprise data taxonomists. It's the enterprise kind of architects and data architects that are coming in and working with the marketing organization to kind of do exactly what you're saying, which is some of this is going to come from the application side, and how do we connect data across the different applications? And that's some of what we help them do, is to really kind of create relationships in the data that don't natively exist in the applications themselves. And then secondly, it's coming from the top down, saying, hey, there are other attributes and elements that we want to capture that are really specific to the enterprise that have nothing to do with the applications that we want to be able to incorporate into that model. And so some of that becomes, the way we think about it is, I'm thinking of just a simple example, is there's associations between, for example, if you think of a car manufacturer like a Toyota, for example, there's associations between make, model, and then other sorts of trim packages and things like that. Just think about from that perspective, like a data model for a car manufacturer. There's all sorts, and those are all related, and they are not, and they're exclusive in some situations. If I have this manufacturer, like Lexus versus Toyota, I only have certain models available, so you can exclude things. And so some of that becomes work that we do with them in helping, and some of it we do internally. We also work with some of the large SIs out there that help work. They help them work through a lot of this, coming up with the right data model and identifying what are the relationships that we're missing that we want to try and enforce in this data model that don't exist through the applications themselves. And so it's a little bit of kind of meeting both ways, if you want to think about that.
Can you give us an example of such a relationship with, I don't know,
Yeah, I mean, creative. I think the example I gave earlier with creative what you have in creative, for example, is if you think about an ad server has, one of the elements of an ad campaign is the actual creative.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, the way that creative gets named inside of the ad serving solution, because in some cases it may be a dynamic ad that gets created, has nothing to do with the way that the asset or the creative is named or identified in the digital asset management solution or other applications you have. And so one way I think about it is, and then if you have assets that you're managing inside of your DAM and it's got a bunch of metadata with their attributes about that piece of creative, how do you associate that creative with that campaign when the way that the IDs are not, there's no linkage between them. And so that's where and then how do you take and associate that campaign, that creative with all these other attributes? That's kind of one simple example of how we help them create those relationships and stitch these things together that don't naturally exist within the applications because they weren't necessarily architected and they weren't meant to work that way.
Yeah, of course. And if I understand correctly, this model that we are talking about is a combination of, let's say, what traditional call a schema, which is more about like relationships and taxonomies.
Yes.
So, or is there also something else, or it's just these two?
Yeah, I mean, the other way to think about it is, we work with a lot of our customers work with agencies. Like I'm thinking about one of our customers right now that has, I think, almost 100 agencies around the globe they work with on the media side. And each one of those agencies is executing and trafficking media. Well, they have trafficking sheets, and in those trafficking sheets, there's naming conventions around how they're naming certain things. Well, agency A and agency B and agency C, if there is not a way to enforce and take them out of the spreadsheets and enforce the way that they're naming that, creating naming conventions and naming data fields similarly, then you can't actually extend your data model out into that. And it's very difficult to extend the data model on the enterprise side out into the agency when you have that much complexity across the agency team. So if you think about it, we're helping the brand extend the enforcement and the use of that data model, not just within their own teams, but even outside of the organization as they think about their business, because it extends, execution happens within those agencies as well. So you may have sheets that are naming convention sheets that are around trafficking or trafficking sheets. And if you've ever seen one of these things, these are spreadsheets that have, they're on version 137 and they're hundreds of rows wide, columns wide, and they've got multiple layers to them, and they're trying to pull in the creative, they're trying to pull in data about the audience, and they're fraught with errors. And our point is like, there's actually a lot of valuable data in that should be part of the enterprise kind of data model and data ecosystem and data store. And so that's one way to think about it is that we're helping those situations where information workers are working in spreadsheets and pulling them into an application.
Yeah. So from what I understand, like, okay, there are, let's say, relationships and also like constraints probably. So you can, let's say, constrain the way that things can get associated with, or like what values they can take and like all that stuff. How do you represent that? I mean, that's a bit of like more technical question, but like what the technology looks like to represent on something that, on a way that like the machine can understand and enforce that, right? Like what technologies are used? Like how do you build your product to do that?
So the underlying technologies?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this comes down to, I don't want to necessarily get into a technology, like what programming language, like that stuff, but what I would say is this, is that when we think about this problem, we think about it very similar to what you're talking about, which is there are known relationships between data and the data model, and there are relationships that need to exist, or there are fields of data that need to be part of the data model that aren't kind of naturally and natively in there. So we can help them bring those in. We also have all sorts of logic in the application that says, hey, if this user again, it's coming back to knowing who the user is, what functions they're responsible for, what campaigns they have, like for example, on the campaign side, what geography, what brands. There's all sorts of way to limit down the number of available fields and the number of available options that you expose to a user based on what you know about the business, what you know about the application or the area of execution, and what you know about the user themselves.
Okay, so let's say we get all the architects and the taxonomies and you all together, and we generate like this unified, let's say, model for a big corporation. Who is consuming that after it is done inside the organization? Who is the main consumer? Yeah.
So what's interesting is if you'd asked me that question a year and a half ago, what I would say is 2 years ago, the primary consumer of this data are the analytics teams within the marketing organizations. What's happened now, though, over the last year and a half, again, some of this is a result of not necessarily what we're doing, but I think it's a bigger trend that's happening within the enterprise, is as more of the functional teams have access to data, large kind of scale cloud-based data infrastructure, they're moving more of that work and payload into those, whether Snowflake or other areas. So we're pushing data now downstream in some of our customers into their BI teams. They are using it to go into they're pushing it into their CDPs. They're pushing it in some cases into whether they're using Snowflake or other applications, they're pushing it into their machine learning and AI infrastructure. Because what they're realizing is, again, the size of data that meets the quality standards to point machines at to make decisions on better decisions on behalf of than humans is really valuable if there's scale.
Yeah.
If there's not scale to the data, and scale of the data is really a byproduct of, in some ways, of the quality of the data and the relationships that exist in the data. And so as I talk about the creation of relationships and the improving the quality of the data through standards, it really is all those kind of different applications are areas where our customers are pushing the data. We have data transformation capabilities in our application that allow them to either we are directly integrated or to push it out to a AWS bucket in a certain format and then be able to capture it and pull it in. But more and more customers are wanting the native integrations so that changes happen in real time. And it's not just about us informing downstream, but the other way to think about it is, I'm thinking of one of our customers who has a very quickly changing set of inventory. It's a large athletic shoe manufacturer. And as they are constantly releasing products, it's how do you keep an up-to-date product catalog available to your marketing organization and other users that are creating campaigns, creating content, all those other things. How do you expose that to them in a way that it's up to date and it's limited to their geography or the channels that they're selling into, and versus, because they have channel conflict and other things. So it's managing things like that as well, and being able to expose, if you call it upstream, product catalog data and other data into the marketing organization and other parts of the business that actually have logic associated with it, and allow them to, again, limit the number of selections and the variance or the variety and the choices that they need to select from to actually get data into this model, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, makes total sense. So if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm not, I see two main, I mean, at least two ways that value is delivered in the organization. One is that it's easier, let's say, you make data easier to be interpreted by people because of the standardization that goes there with the data model. And the other thing is data quality, right? When you have reference schema and the taxonomies, which also like add a lot into the quality aspect, you can increase and monitor like quality a lot. But when it comes to quality, there's always something can go wrong. Someone will mess with the data, let's say, right? So what happens then? Like how the tools that you have in place, like the product that you have, can help or not help, I don't know, I mean, with addressing the issues that are created.
Yeah, I mean, so one way to think about it is we think about solving data quality, like traditionally you think about data quality has sort of been solved reactively in the data pipeline or down, with ETL downstream, or there's lots of ways it's been solved downstream, because when you get ready to actually utilize the data in runtime, you realize that we got problems. So there's a lot of that gets fixed downstream. We see it differently. We look at it and say, listen, if you put in place data standards on the front end, there's a proactive way to solve a lot of the data quality issues. We're not going to solve, it's not about solving world hunger, but it's about solving a set of problems that are kind of type 2 problems, where you think about context and things that really enable the organization to create a way to bridge between the creative side, or the creatives, if you want to call that, and the quants, and actually create a more holistic way of thinking about data quality. Because typically data quality is that the problem gets kind of shoved downstream, and it's data engineers, data analysts, and data scientists that are dealing with data quality. Yeah. We think that there's a better way to solve it, which is if you put tools in place that enable the information workers on the front end to solve some of this, then it benefits downstream. You're not going to solve everything. We also have situations where customers are revalidating data. So they're running data back through our application to again, always banging it up against the standard to make sure that to see where there are problems. And that's kind of how we think about it. Is it's a very different way of thinking about solving data quality rather than fixing data quality.
Makes sense. No, that's very interesting. And okay, we talked about like how we can make like the data easier to be, let's say, managed by machines with the validation and like all that stuff. So what about interpretability? Like how this model that has been created at the end can be communicated to a huge organization, right? Because from what I understand, we are talking about like organizations that are really, really big. You might have like, I don't know, hundreds of stakeholders that they have to agree on these definitions that this schema has. So how does this work? How technology can help and how organization can help? Because I assume that probably like the solution is somewhere in between. It's not like just a technical problem.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what we've seen, and we're seeing it less so now, I think there's more thought being put into this kind of proactively within the organizations, but really organizations have to come to, in some ways, an agreement on what is that data model that we're going to use to operate. Not that it can't change, but we typically get involved with them in a situation where they sort of have that solved, or they're close to having that solved, and we may help them. Because we have so much context from all of our other customers, we may come in and say, hey, you may want to think about these other fields of data that may be important to your business. There's company X over here that's in a similar field or whatever. There are other attributes that you guys should be collecting that you're not identifying and standardizing. And so some of that we come in and help them with, but a lot of times that's either being done internally with, like we talked about earlier, the architects and the business users and like for marketing, or there's situations where we get brought in where they've already engaged with a Deloitte Digital or an Accenture, and it's the how do we deploy and activate this model that we built into the and make it into the organization. Because what we've seen is organizations have data taxonomies, they sit in these taxonomy solutions, but they're not connected to anything. So it's kind of like, that's great, but it's sort of shelfware. And so it's about making it active and making it actually usable and functional by the information workers. And that's kind of what we connect the you want to talk about it, we connect the architects and the taxonomists with the business people, and that's ultimately who needs to solve it. But there's a lot of cases where it has to be facilitated by third parties that have been through this many times before. But it's surprising how many the organizations themselves know this stuff better than anybody. It's just making it a priority and getting the right people in the room to actually have those debates and have those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. One last question from me. I mean, you have implemented this process in like many different companies. How different the implementation is from company to company, and how much you can end up and say like, okay, there is at the end one distilled model for marketing that makes sense for pretty much everyone. Okay, there are like edge cases and some specializations on that, but this model, like if you take it, you pretty much understand like, let's say 80% of what marketing is like in an organization.
Yeah, the way I think about that is there are, I'll call it elements of those models that are fairly standard. There are also big portions of it that are unique in the sense that each business, if you think about context, each business is organized and structured differently. And I saw this with one of our customers, and we see more and more where our data is now ending up in the finance organization, because what they're realizing is, wait a second, we're trying to do profitability analysis and all sorts of analysis from a finance perspective, but we don't necessarily have a way of looking at the data as it relates to the way we think about the business from a P&L perspective, around business units, around contribution margins by business units, by product lines and things. And so that, when you think about product lines, business units, the structure of the organization, that's the part of it that becomes sort of unique. It's not like every single one of them is different, but the elements of that are really have to be customized and be aligned with the organization itself. And so there are pieces of it that I would say are standard, and there are elements of it that are unique to that organization, which is really where you think about organizational context versus the channel or the application context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question before I give it to Eric. Last one, I promise. So how much and how often you see these models changing inside the organization? And is there like some indication, like some dimension of the organization that whenever it changes, let's say also this reflects back to the model? Like, are there some kind of connections there?
Yeah, I mean, again, these models change as as they're adding. Well, let me say it differently. There's a difference between the model changing and the underlying data itself, or the available attributes in those fields, if you want to call it that. Well, that, for some customers, like I mentioned earlier, that stuff is constantly changing, and there's a bunch of logic around that. Mm-hmm. The models themselves do change, but that is a much more of an organizational discussion and there's controls around that, and there's even ways that particular functional areas or users or geographies can actually, there's no reason they can't modify their model, but it's being able to say, hey, this is the standard model that we've agreed on as an organization, and there's these attributes that are added by this geography, and it's how we treat them differently when we do analysis, understanding that this was built in there for a specific purpose that has nothing to do with the way we think about it, looking at it holistically from an organizational perspective. And so there's some of that nuance that we can, and we help them manage that and understand and put a lot of controls around who, where, when these models can be changed, because you can't have people, you have to be very specific about who has that ability and who has the rights to do that. So some of that's around governance and access, but yes, they do change, but for the most part, the core kind of capital D data model versus the lowercase d, there's a difference in how and when those change and how frequently.
Yeah, super interesting. Eric, all yours.
I'm loving this. I mean, just the concept of, I think, Verl, what's so interesting to me is that this kind of data is so rarely talked about within an organization, yet it's the kind of data that makes existing data so much more valuable, which is super interesting. I may be wrong with this with this parallel, but one thing that really strikes me as I think about what you're doing is that in many ways, like you talk about, let's say the creator who has a ton of context, right? That feels very similar to taking unstructured data and applying structure to it.
Exactly.
And when I think about that, one of the, which this is going to sound very buzzwordy, but I start to think about things like machine learning or graphs, networks, where you can discover connections that previously were undiscoverable because everything was unstructured. Is that something you're exploring, something you already do? I'd just love to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're hitting at is, and this goes back to what I was kind of mentioning earlier, this kind of connection between quants and creatives and things, is that, again, where we're laser focused, and I think, as you step back, every organization out there, whether they know it or not, actually is dealing with this problem. And most of them recognize that they're not sure how, and I think to a large degree, we come in situations where we'll be brought in by one group and they'll bring other people to the meeting, other groups to the meeting, and people will sit down and within 5 minutes they're like, oh my gosh, yes, this is a huge, we know this is a problem, we've not talked about it, and we've sort of pretended like it didn't exist because there's not a lot of people up from us that really understand it. So we just kind of like keep shoving it under the carpet, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem as the scale gets bigger, right? And the gaps are getting wider. But as you're talking about almost like a neural network, like in some ways, I'm not sure that's our problem to solve. I really think that what we're trying to do is enable our customers, their machine learning teams, their kind of data science teams, to use the technology they're using, but augment it with this data or this information or this context. And that's really kind of how we see the world. And we don't care. We're very, we look at this as we play Switzerland in this, and then we want to make this available wherever it's needed to be available, where it adds value. And we'll integrate upstream wherever we know there are challenges in getting context into either campaign data or performance data or whatever.
That's super interesting, and it totally makes sense. I'm just thinking about use cases where, let's say you have a pretty wide set of product lines. You might discover something with the added context about the relationship between product lines and a particular subset of consumers who meet certain demographics that would be hard to discover, just with your basic, clickstream and purchase data, for example. That's super interesting. So you're essentially providing a data set that a machine learning or data science team could use to draw that conclusion. Super interesting.
Yeah, and again, that's that data. It's like you said earlier, it's kind of stamped on the behavioral or that other data, so it gets stamped onto it in a sense.
Yeah. Okay. One last question, because we're getting close to the buzzer here. Could you just give us one example? So the marketing and sort of content asset use case makes total sense. You mentioned earlier in the show that there's some other contexts where it makes sense, and some of those popped to mind for me, but I'd just love to hear from your perspective, what are other areas of the organization where this kind of sort of, unstructured context to structured stamping, if you will, makes a lot of sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've really been pretty laser focused on marketing, but what's interesting is we had a situation recently where we were brought into it was interesting. It's back to kind of think about the Adobe situation where you're talking about integrating multiple solutions that have been acquired. And it was a company that acquired a number of demand side platforms, DSP solutions, and it's solutions for buying, programmatic buying and selling of media. The problem they ran, it's interesting, they were trying to use I think it was Informatica or some other solution, to try and map data together that allowed their finance teams to appropriately bill clients across platforms. And so,
interesting.
Be able to expose inventory across the different platforms, having the one team sell it and having one buyer. And the problem they were running into, and it came up, I guess, the reason they came to us is the problem got exposed by auditors and was something they were going to have to disclose. Their massive public company they were going to have to disclose in their financials. It was a couple $100 million problem. Like ultimately, they were like, "There's $1 billion opportunity here that we can't actually get access to because we got this underlying data problem." Well, think about not just like campaign creation or content creation, but if you've got a sales team that is creating sales orders and around inventory that is being bought from different through different DSPs or different platforms, how do you standardize that down so that you know and are able to associate the stuff, that inventory, the fulfillment and that stuff together? And that's really what they brought us in for, was to really try and help map that. And I think that is probably, to me, that kind of, it wasn't something they approached us. I don't know how they even heard, I can't remember how they heard about us, but it was one of those situations where you're like, okay, I would never have thought of that as us as a solution for that. And so it kind of opens my mind. And again, we've been so focused on where we're going that there are other applications. Anywhere you have people interacting with applications, I think and it's outside marketing. You've got people on supply chain, you've got people on sales, other places. It is the same. There's a similar opportunity in all those situations. And it's we've chosen to start here. It's mainly because that's our DNA. And we see the problem as being something that our customers are seeing as a big challenge. And I think we just feel like that's a natural place for us to start. And we get pulled into other, and the content thing came up through another customer that pulled us in saying, "Hey, we've got this problem. I think you guys can help us solve it." So that's kind of how it came through a customer.
Yeah. Fascinating. It makes total sense when you think about, like, going to your example with finance, reconciling transactions that have happened that relate to inventory across distinct siloed platforms is essentially a mass reconciliation problem. Super interesting. Well, Verl, this has been such a fun episode. I love talking about data and uses of data and context for data, sort of outside the standard stuff that we talk about. And it sounds like you're doing some really fascinating things at Claravine, sort of bringing that to light. So thank you for your time and thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot, Eric. Kostas, thank you.
I think my big takeaway from the episode is that I really started thinking about context more. Verl mentioned context, and he talked a lot about people who are doing certain types of work, right? They're producing work. And in that context, it was, marketing assets, right? A piece of content or a campaign. But I just thought about all the touch points across an organization where people are producing work, and the amount of context that's in their head is unbelievable. And in many ways, that sort of is what brings value to the work. And so that whole concept is just fascinating to me, about how you sort of mine, like, how can you mine that context and actually turn it into actual physical data, in a defined schema. I think I'll be thinking about that all week, because just, from a philosophical standpoint, it's pretty interesting paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I'll keep from this conversation is that, first of all, spreadsheets are still the king. Like,
they're never going away.
Yeah, they're like cockroaches, man. Like, you cannot get rid of them.
Is that why they named Cockroach DB Cockroach DB?
No, I mean, that's, yeah. We had an episode about that, but we didn't discuss the name because it's a little bit controversial. But
that's right.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, like, what was like super interesting is that there are roles inside organization, like really big ones, that we didn't even think about, like having people that they have to build and maintain data taxonomies, for example, which is pretty amazing. And together, like with data architects, like you have the people who are creating at the end, let's say, a data representation of the whole organization that needs to be communicated to everyone. What I'll keep from the conversation that we had is that these problems at the end, and I think this is like not just, it has to do with data in general. At the end, success is like figuring out the right balance between how much technology can do and how much humans have to agree, and how we can do both and do both well. So that's what I keep from the conversation. And I'm really looking forward to see when similar products will also hit the market, like for smaller companies and medium-sized organizations.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a multinational corporation, the pain point is severe simply due to size and complexity. And so the problem is exacerbated, but we've had similar problems at every company I've ever been at, even if they're really small.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, yeah, I agree. I don't think that this is a problem only for the organization, like very large corporations, just that they cannot survive without solving these problems. That's the difference.
Yep.
That's why I'm saying that we are going to see at some point products that they try to address these problems also, like in startups, or like for smaller companies, or like for medium-sized organizations.
I agree. All right. Well, thanks for joining us on the DataStack Show. Fun topic for you today, and we'll catch you on the next one.